3 times if you can. All right, moving along. I hope nobody minds. We're 15 minutes behind schedule. Okay, so next we're going to move on to a question for Cutcha. And the question is, what is the problem? Is it capitalism? Is it colonialism? Is it me? Is it the 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions? Is it Jeff Bezos?
It's Jeff Bezos. No, I really spend like an inordinate amount of time in my life really angry at Jeff Bezos. And I have like a whole speech I went and gave to San Diego State where I basically just like talked shit about Jeff Bezos for 20 minutes. And at the end of it, I got hate mail. I actually got handwritten hate mail in that one that was sent to my office. It was like 8 pages of handwritten. And they were like, why do you hate Jeff Bezos? And I was like, he sort of to me like embodies everything about capitalism and just like one tiny little dude. And I try to tell my students, like, you need to pay attention to this because I have lots of kids that I work with and they admire these men. They admire these men who make money. They're sort of being told, and I don't think anybody sits them down and is like, you should really admire Jeff Bezos, but they're being told that that he's very smart because he has a lot of money, that he obviously knows what he's doing because he has a lot of money, that we should all look up to him because he has a lot of money. And I just want to be like, I get really annoyed that we think there's something really smart about him. And I also talk a lot about how I can't really stand that we don't have this conversation about how he literally has so much money that he could do all of the things that we're all fighting for all the time. Like, he could just sort of pay for it. He could pay all of his workers $150,000 a year, and it wouldn't even bother him. He wouldn't even notice. And the fact that he doesn't says everything you need to know about him as a person. Because I don't know where we took like the humanity out of what was happening there, but I listen a lot to people in my life, and they're like, he had to become that way to become that rich. Like, you can't be a good person and do that in this system. So I start off with him. I was like, I can't. He doesn't know me, but we're in a very big like turf war over everything. And he's gonna come to me and be like, what's your problem with me? No, he's not. He doesn't care, right? He's very busy with like all the Inquirer craziness and stuff like that. But I will say that I think that it's important all the time for me that I center the fact that capitalism, we shouldn't be talking about capitalism. We shouldn't be talking about the things that people are able to do here without talking about colonialism and sort of the foundation that made for what people were able to do here, how we were able to create this system. It's built on the backs of the genocide of Native peoples and the enslavement of African Americans, and you can't get away from that. How can you reform a system that's built on that? It shouldn't even be here. And I always tell people it reminds us that when we start trying to justify it, when we start trying to think like, but, and be like, we have to always go back to the beginning. And the beginning is that they had to kill a bunch of people and enslave a bunch of people. And anybody, I mean anybody, any old white family who has a lot of money only got that way because they were killing a bunch of Native people and enslaving a bunch of African Americans. And if you know that your money comes from that, then you have a responsibility to give it back. I think it's really that simple. And I start talking about you gotta give it back, and I do these talks everywhere I go, and then I always get these like really like nice white people that come up to me after I do talks, and they're like, so you want me to like give you my house? And then I'm always like, sure, you know, I'll take it. But I'm always like, you gotta think bigger than that. I always get people too that they're like, are you really saying you want us to give back like all the land? Like, how's that gonna work? And I'm like, do you like own a lot of land somewhere? Like, is there like, you got like thousands of acres somewhere? You're really concerned that I'm like coming for your land? And every time I ask this question to people, they go, no, I don't own anything. Like, I don't own a condo, I don't own an apartment, like nothing. And I'm like, what are you so worried about? Like, it's not, like really in the United States of America, we don't own a majority of this land. we're talking about like all of our national parks and our state parks and the federal land, like the land the federal government owns, and they have that because they stole it. So the whole thing about capitalism is it's based on like stealing and killing and robber baroning, and then we're acting like this is a system that somehow could work, that it doesn't make like absolutely no sense. So my thing is we can't have a conversation about capitalism without understanding colonialism. And we also need to remember that while we are all, it's great that we all feel individually tied to and responsible for what this future looks like, it is not just an individual problem, it is a corporation problem. And we have to push back against this idea that somehow we all stop taking showers, we could like save and solve the water problem. We have to push back against the idea that if somehow we all stopped doing one thing, like we need to remember that at a larger level, there are things operating that are much bigger than us that are trying to keep us from being able to make that kind of dent. But I will say this, I know sometimes it feels like you can go into situations and you're like, not everybody's on board, but the more people I talk to, the more students that I reach out to, they always start in the same place. I'll be like, capitalism is the problem. And they'll be like, capitalism? I don't know. I mean, I really like, like my car, and I really like buying stuff, and I really like eBay or whatever. And I'm always like, let's think about why you think that there's nothing beyond this. Let's do that together. And usually they're able to have that conversation by the end where they just go, there has to be something else, something more complex, something that we can put together. And I always say, well, if you look back at indigenous peoples, our political, social, economic, whatever you want to call it, systems were very complex. And what they were tied in fundamentally was our humanity and our kinship, the fact that we are all related. So we should treat each other as if we are relatives and family. Which means that Jeff Bezos is technically in kinship to me. So I feel like at some point I will meet him and I'll be like, what's up? Let's give all your money away. And people think that it's not something that works, but I've started to call it inception. I say these things out loud in public spaces. They float into people's little heads. 5 years later, they're like, I should give all my money away. They don't know why. And I'm always like, that's a fantastic idea. I say things out loud to make them possible. I think we all have to start saying things out loud, even if they sound impossible.
Anybody else want to talk about Jeff?
Yeah, I'll talk about Jeff. Jeff might be a problem, but he's not the problem. So I think it is a problem, I think, to think about capitalism as a problem of individual behavior. There are a lot of bad actors out there, no doubt, hateful, greedy, despicable characters. But the problem is more systemic than that, right? Jeff is doing what he's supposed to do in this system, right? The whole economic meltdown, all the shenanigans on Wall Street, they were pushing the boundaries within, for the most part, not some of them went over that legal line, but for the most part, they were pushing that boundary within the framework of capitalism, and they were doing what they're supposed to do, given the system, given the assumptions, given the logic of capitalism, and they were being cheered on and applauded. And it's true, absolutely, they're held up, these wealthy people are held up as models, not only because they're rich, but because they're doing what they're supposed to be, they're competing, they're out-competing, they're doing everything they can to maximize their profits. It's not a story just about greed and money. It's that they're good capitalists, right? That's our entire system. And what happens if you think that it's just bad behavior, then the answer is carrying capitalism, right? The answer is moral suasion. The answer is let's just appeal to the hearts of capitalists, and that will never work because the system inevitably is going to follow its logic of profit maximization and crushing all that humanity out of it, because that's not what it's about. That's not what the system is about.
A second question center decolonization in our post-capitalism framework and give the land, the baskets, the resources, the regalia back?
I will say this, just give it back. I always tell people, like, I really wish it was really hard to give land back. People make it hard because they get really uncomfortable with that idea. I wish it was hard to, like, give baskets back. If you have baskets in your collection, it's really easy to reach out to somebody and be like, I want to give these back. And we'll find a way to get them back to somebody, right? Like, I heard this great story from a friend of mine. She works for a foundation, and she said at some point this guy called her up on the phone, and he was all, I own this house in Eureka, and when I die, I want to leave it to the WIAT so I can give it back to them. And she was all, are you sure? And he goes, well, it's theirs, isn't it? And so they wrote up a thing, and that's what he did. The end. He just gave it back. And so then she texted the WIAT tribal chair, and she said, there's this guy in Eureka, when he dies, he wants to leave you his house because he wants to give his land back to the WIAT. And the chair wrote back, sweet. I think that we have to remember that there are indigenous peoples here, that we didn't go anywhere, that we were never making plans not to be here. I always tell people, like, other people were saying, like, you're gonna die soon, or like you're gonna go away, or you're gonna disappear. But we were always like, no, not really. We were making plans for 7 generations. That's our whole thing, right? We were thinking about the future. Our whole thing was futurisms. It was thinking about what the future was going to look like. So the things that we did were about how we're gonna set up our futures. We were thinking about our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids. We're still doing that. It's the reason why we fight for dam removal. Dam removal is not about us. There's gonna be a lot of recovery that has to come from that. But we know that in 7 generations, that's going to be really important for our next generations. So we're doing it now. So I think that when we go into public spaces, we have to say those things out loud. I always am doing it. I call it being an indigenous Debbie Downer. Like, I come into spaces and people are like, this is a great thing we're doing. And I'm like, actually, it's really based on, like, the continued misappropriation of Indian land, and you're not doing anything. You know what I mean? And they go like, oh, thanks for really Debbie Downering this situation. I'll go to, like, parties. Nobody invites me to Napa anymore. Because they're like, look at this great thing, Napa, we get to go drink wine. I'm like, all the wine industry is based on the enslavement of California Indians, which they did in the 1800s so that they could build all of this land into the wine industry. And now we continue that with exploitive labor. And then they're like, oh, thanks for coming to my wine party. But I think we have to remind people of those things so that they can start to think about, like, what goes beyond that. I love this idea of giving land back, and I say it in all the spaces in which I can come to, and I know it's possible because we did it here. They have given a part of Tuluwat back to the Wiyot people, and I want to remind people that that's very important, because for a long time, all people knew about Tuluwat is that it was called Indian Island, and the reason why it was called Indian Island is because 150 to 300 Wiyot people were massacred there during a world renewal ceremony, and the stories that tended to start and stop with the massacre. But the Wiyot people, they don't tell that story about a story of massacre and death. That's a story of renewal. They are now doing their world renewal ceremony on that island. That took 150 years. That's how far forward they were willing to reach to make it happen again. So it's actually a story of renewal and revitalization. It's not a story of massacres. So who gets to tell that story, and why it's so important that they're there? And I have to remind people that that's what this is really about. So give it all back. If you're like a person who knows somebody that has a bunch of land, if you're in like a meeting, if somebody's saying, oh, I'm gonna donate this thing, you should be like, you should talk to the indigenous peoples and give it back to them. I say it all the time out loud. I've said it to Humboldt State several times, because Humboldt State is getting a large donation of land from a timber company, and I said, why don't we just give it back to the Wiyot? And I can't tell you how many people were like, that never even came up in any conversation. And I don't think we have an excuse anymore, because it's already happened. It's happening all over the world. So if we center decolonization in the things that we do, to me that centers this idea that indigenous peoples need to be centered in our movements. They need to be centered in the things that we do. But they need to be centered as living. They need to be centered as vibrant. They need to be centered as knowledgeable. They need to be centered as people that are important to anything that we do. And I don't think it's really hard to do that anymore. We're all on Twitter. So you can look us up and learn everything and talk to us and ask us questions. Like, you can hashtag native Twitter. I do it all the time, and I just get all kinds of answers to things. Like, we are out there trying to make this known. So I will say, like, don't think that there's a reason to think that any space you're in doesn't have Indigenous peoples. Everywhere. We are everywhere.
Anyone else on that one? All right.
I do want to say one thing though that I forgot to mention. We have an Alexa, which was given to our family by my husband's grandfather, and he taught it so that whenever you ask a question about Jeff Bezos, our Alexa says, "Jeff Bezos is a piece of shit." And I asked him, like, at one point, like, why did you do that? Like, why did you train her to do that? And he said, well, someday when she becomes sentient, I want her to know she's like her own woman, and that she does not have to listen to Jeff Bezos because he's a piece of shit. And I was all, she is going to send drones to kill all the human beings, but it's going to get to you, and she's going to be like, that's a cool dude. I think those little moments for me remind me that, like, we exist in this space where we can have humor about what's happening, but it also lets everybody around us know, like, that's important for us to be able to have a real conversation about this. Like, we have to be able to laugh at some of the ridiculousness of capitalism.
I didn't say anything earlier because I didn't want to take up too much space, but one of the central things that we have kind of concentrated on in our work is trying to decommodify as much land in our community as possible. And within the current system, you know, what enables us to do some aspect of that is setting up a community land trust. So, you know, that has been a priority of ours, over and above, you know, almost everything in truth. But we don't want to stop there. The decommodification is one way of fighting back gentrification and enabling, you know, our people who are there to be able to try to stay there against kind of the market-driven forces around housing, which force a lot of people in this country, you know, to move here and back and forth, right? But we want to try to take it further and trying to explore, following our own understanding of decolonization. Where we live, it's the Choctaw Nation, it's Choctaw land that we're on. And so trying to figure out, you know, in a way outside of kind of U.S. law, but not in a way that would be attacked by it, which is tricky, given the Mississippi law, how to put the land trust in Choctaw's possession and work out just kind of a land lease arrangement, you know, that we are doing that's respective of our two peoples, and trying to eliminate the third party of the United States government to it. So that's something that we're thinking about, trying to envision. If you know of any kind of experiment similar to this anywhere in the world that has some, you know, precedent to it, please share it with us so we can try to advance it in our work.